Hey, welcome to Life in the Leadership Lane. I'm your host, Bruce Waller, where I'm talking to leaders that are making a difference in the workplace and in the community. What did they do to get started, and what are they doing to continue accelerating in the leadership lane? And today I'm talking to a very special guest, a good friend of mine, Tony Bridwell. He's the SVP and Chief People Officer at Ryan. He is known as a culture architect. He's also a board member, a speaker, a podcast host. He does a lot of things, folks, and he's even a best-selling author. And that's one of the things that I'm excited about talking to Tony today. So welcome to the show, Tony.
I tell you, this is, if I could think of any way to spend my day, this is it right here. Thank you so much. Man, this is, of course, you and I have been talking for about 20 minutes before we ever hit record. That's kind of how you and I are. We just get together and we just start talking and start sharing, and life just starts happening. We probably should have hit record about 20 minutes ago.
Exactly. One thing I enjoy talking to you, Tony, two things. Number one, you put a smile on my face every time I see you. But number two, I always learn something from you. And so when I thought about you being on the podcast, I thought, this is going to be great because somebody out there is going to learn something today. And so extremely honored you're on the show. I know you're a busy guy. We're actually recording this in the end of June. It's going to post in July of 2020. So we're during COVID. What's going on today? Where are you? Are you working from the office? Are you working from home?
Man, I wish that my office at the building looked like this. This is my home office, which is kind of weird because most of the world has converted a spot in their house into their new work from home space. I can see yours pretty cool right there with all your books behind you and everything like that. Mine's actually reversed. All of my books are in front of me. And so when we bought this old home, this is a 1956 old home in old part of Dallas. The reason, look, people buy houses for a lot of reasons. My wife bought it for the kitchen, utility room, and the backyard. I bought it for this room right here. And so this room was converted. In the wall that I'm facing here is just all bookshelves as far as you can go. And then back behind my shoulder here is another room that's just all bookshelves and everything. And it's been my writing space. Matter of fact, I've written, 3 of my 5 books at this spot right here. Well, and other spots too, because I'll take a little vacation and go someplace and write 4 or 5 chapters, or I'll go in town someplace. But 3 of my 5 books have been written right here, and it's my study more than it is anything else, right? It's my place where I kind of go and I just read and I relax and I write. And work has a little bit taken it over now. So I've got dual monitors. I got 2 35-inch monitors in front of me. It looks a little bit like a command center now, but it's become the second office. And you can see right behind me, right there. That's one of my pride and joys. My daughter got that for me for my birthday, Father's Day, which typically falls pretty close, well, almost on the same day, several years in a row. That is a 1911 typewriter that still works. Tick, 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 bing, it still works. And for 2 of my last 2 books, I have written the first chapter, or at least the first page, on that old typewriter right there, 1911, the serial number. I was able to trace it back to when it was built. Every time I look at that, you just have to imagine, Bruce, just imagine the stories that were written on that thing. 1911 is when that typewriter was built. And so I'm always interested, we live in this world of Zoom right now, and the story that we tell with where we are. We have our personal offices and everything like that. But in my study, which has been kind of weird, it's been overtaken with work, which is a whole nother story that we can talk about. There's just all kinds of stuff. I mean, this picture right here, as you can imagine, custom art by my daughter for when I was Chief People Officer at, of all places, Brinker. It's the big chili pepper that she created for me. Yeah, and the closer you get to it, the more it's a 3-dimensional piece of art. And so when you get closer to that, there's little snippets that she has taken. It's like different layers. It's 3-dimensional. So you'll see an old menu, a business card, a note that I've written her, or something like that, all hidden in this picture right here. So first book cover right there, art from the first book cover that Allie did right there. So it's just kind of fun being surrounded by life. Yours is the same way. You got just about everything you treasure and everything you enjoy right there behind you.
I love it. You talk a lot about story, and the books you're referring to, of course, the difference maker, the king maker, the newsmaker, the change maker, and now Saturday Morning Tea. I'm going to hold up the book. We're going to talk about this book, and a lot of these, or all of these books, you talk about story. And I would like for you to start with your story and just share your story of just when you grew up. Where did you grow up? How did you get into HR, and what's that story like?
Well, this is why you and I can get together, and we can go not talk for 6 months. We can get together and instantly pick up and just go because we share common roots. Look, I grew up in Oklahoma just like you did, and I'm not going to bury the lead. I'm going to skip right to the end. Your beautiful bride and I have known each other since we were kids. We went to school together. We graduated together. We stomped around the same, one stoplight town growing up in Duncan, Oklahoma. And it's crazy. Our parents, after I left, our parents lived 2 houses from each other in town, which is just mind blowing, but that's just how it is. I grew up in Oklahoma, and the part of the world I grew up in, you really had just a couple of choices, and one of them was working in the oil patch. And, growing up in Duncan, where Halliburton started, working in the oil patch, I tease about this all the time. I was 14 before I realized, not everybody wore red coveralls. I just thought that was just a way of life, that, at some point you got a pair of red coveralls and you walked around missing a digit or an arm because you worked in the oil patch. And it's just like all my friends, all their parents, all their grandparents, they all worked in the oil patch. And you either worked for the oil patch or you worked supporting the oil patch in some way. And my dad was one of those. I mean, he owned his own business in town, and he was a contractor and did just a ton of things. We built homes and all of that. And so I had made a choice when I was going through school, and because I had dyslexia, they didn't discover until my last semester of my senior year in high school. School was hard for me, and so I leaned into something that I did really well, and that was architecture. And I was very fortunate. Now, this is something that people that listen to this may not know because they didn't grow up in Oklahoma, but growing up in Oklahoma, especially in the southern part of Oklahoma, being a tradesman was very, very important. Still is, matter of fact. It's one of the most important roles that we have in our economy. And the VOTEC, we call it VOTEC, the vocational technical schools. Remember those? They're scattered all throughout the state. Played a huge role in educating a lot of people, and you learned the trades. You learned carpentry and masonry and electricity and being an electrician, an air conditioning person. And then you learn machining and auto body and auto mechanics. And one of the areas they had was mechanical and architectural drafting. And school was hard for me. So I made a choice when I was a junior in high school that I could take half of my day at VOTEC and the other half at school. And they'd bust us out to the VOTEC, and we'd take half our day learning a trade. And right, wrong, or indifferent, because my dad was in construction, architecture was always something I kind of leaned toward. I mean, I grew up around it. It's just something that I knew. And so I thought I'd give it a chance and see what happened. Well, dyslexia is an interesting creature. Words are jumbled, but I can see things three-dimensionally. And man, I took to it like a duck on water. And at VOTEC, every year they'd have kind of an Olympic competition against all the VOTECs, and they would compete, who could build the quickest brick wall, who could, frame up a corner of a house based off a set of plans, and who could diagnose and repair a car. And it was just kind of fun. Every year we'd compete as a state, and the winners at state would go on to a national competition. And in architecture, this was interesting. You would have to draw a complete set of home plans, house plans. They'd give you a spec and they'd say, okay, here it is. Now design it, draw it, and present it. And you had 3 hours to do it. And I won the entire state of Oklahoma. My senior year, I was awarded the top architectural, at the time, draftsman in the state of Oklahoma, and that got me a scholarship to Oklahoma State. And so my ticket out of the oil patch,
wow,
was into architecture. Not very many people know that. I haven't told that story. I haven't told that story in forever. That was one of those real proud moments. You know, here you are, a scrawny kid from Oklahoma that struggled all through school. I joke all the time, Bruce, that, you know, I was in the half that made the top half possible. You know, but I found a little bit of my calling, and when I say a little bit, it was a foundational part that I learned when that I was good at something. Because, you know, my whole high school life, I was always told I wasn't going to be good at anything because, you know, I read slower than everyone else. I couldn't spell. Writing was hard for me because I couldn't get any of the words right. And it was just hard. I loved to read, but it would take me 4 times longer than anybody else to read. But I learned how to tell stories, and I learned how to listen to stories. And somehow I fell in love with architecture. Went to school for that and studied architecture for quite some time. Well, half of my school, I studied architecture, and then had an opportunity to play college basketball. Not at Oklahoma State. Not at Oklahoma State. But the second part of the calling on my life was I found that my faith started budding when I was in, a junior in high school. You know, it's just me and my dad. We grew up just us. My parents divorced when I was just barely old enough to understand what divorce was. It's just me and my dad. And you and I have talked about mentors a ton in our life. And I had a youth pastor in one of the churches there in Duncan that took a liking to me. And he saw something that I didn't see. Isn't that how it is with most mentors too? That they see something that we can't see. You know, when I write about it now, I call it blind spots. And he pulled me into church, probably saved my life the first time. My life has certainly been saved multiple times. And I started digging in deep into what it looked like to have a faith walk. Didn't know much about it. I was ornery, still trying to figure out everything. But I got halfway through college and I felt that tug on my heart that I needed to do more with that in my life. And there was an opportunity to study that more in depth. And I really felt that calling into the ministry full time at that point. So I went to a non-denominational school in South Texas, in Houston, which, believe it or not, today is in Oklahoma City. Mid-American Christian University in Oklahoma City, on the south side of Oklahoma City. You've been to the city 100 times, 1,000 times. Brandywine Golf Course, it sits right across the street. And went down and played college basketball and studied theology and started this path. I thought, okay, architecture is really cool, but I think I'm going to go into full-time ministry. And I got out of school and had to get a job. And my first job was working in a small church. Now, here's a little bit of a throwback for you, in Meridian, Oklahoma.
Wow.
Now, okay, so picture Duncan, picture Comanche, going down the old 81 highway. Meridian was halfway, and there wasn't even a stop sign. You remember the old refinery right there south of town? Well, that was Meridian, and it wasn't even a stop sign. And the church I was attending at the time, I was home for summer, and Pastor Dan Pruitt, he said, Tony, if you're going to do this, you need to jump into it. He said, there's a good friend of mine, Pastor Bill, down in Meridian. He needs some help. I want you to go down there and work for him. I'm in.
Oh,
I made $13 a week.
That's fantastic.
It was a little shotgun church. It had like 3 rooms in it, and on an Easter Sunday, it might seat 50.
Now, is this after you graduated from Oklahoma State?
I left Oklahoma State early, went to Mid-America, and then was there, and then played basketball. And so after 2 years there, I was home for a summer.
Okay.
And he said, hey, I think you need to do this. And so went to work there, and I was everything. He was pastor, I was everything else. And we didn't have a choir, but I was choir director. We only had 5 people in the youth, but I was the youth director. And we didn't have a janitor, so I took care of the janitor. And so in the midst of all that, I thought, well, I'm all grown up now, and I know everything there is to know. And so I figured I'm just going to get married in the middle of everything else. And what's crazy is I wasn't smart enough to know that you couldn't support a family on $13 a week.
Exactly.
So I had to get, and I'll never forget this conversation. I had to get a real job, is what someone told me. And this was interesting. Early in my life, I felt I had to give something up to go do something else. And a lot of times I think people face this little bit of crisis of faith, regardless of what it is, that you feel like things are mutually exclusive. I had to give up one to go do something else. And, what I was discovering, Bruce, is that all through my life, layers of my purpose was being built all throughout my life. And the first layer was this wonderful layer of understanding this beautiful thing that we see every single day as architecture. For me, it's something much, much bigger. It's about building something, right? It's about seeing raw materials, about going out and seeing a piece of land and envisioning something on there. It's about going and seeing a structure that has been dilapidated and seeing the potential to renovate. And it taught me so much about details. It taught me so much about seeing beyond just the surface. It's taught me about understanding that, the functionality of something is as important as how good it looks. There's so much I learned from that. And, while I was going through it, for some reason, I thought it was just about architecture. I thought it was just about owning my own firm. I thought it was just about driving the cool car. I thought it was just about doing big buildings. And I've done all that. But at the end of the day, what it taught me is that there is structure and organization in everything. And when I go into an organization and I see people, I see potential. I see building blocks. I see details, and I see organizational structure differently. I think that had I come up and grown into HR in a traditional manner, I see it differently than most people do it. And it's because of this love and this purpose that I've had for that. And then when I got into the ministry, man, I started breaking my heart for people. And then I realized that, people are pretty important. And it's interesting that, we still have to work with them. The machines haven't taken over.
Not yet.
Yeah. And it took me a while to figure this out, but when I did, it was pretty radical idea for me. And that is, everybody's at a different mile marker in this journey. And, for a long time, I thought everybody had to be the exact same. And it was interesting that as I was growing and I had to go get a quote unquote real job, I thought I was going to have to leave all that other stuff behind. I thought I was going to have to leave the ministry. But I realized that everywhere I went was working with people, and it was how I could serve. It was how I could be better than where I was before. So I was very fortunate in the early mid 80s in little bitty Duncan, Oklahoma, way before the internet was a glimmer in anyone's eyes. I got two papers, the Dallas Morning News and the paper from the city. Now, when you and I say, I got a paper from the city or I'm going to the city, you and I both know that we're going to Oklahoma City.
Yeah, exactly.
Because we grew up. It's like, where are you going this weekend? I'm going to the city. Everybody knew you were going to Oklahoma City. But when you say it down here, they're going, which one, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I got the paper from Oklahoma City. I got the paper from Dallas and opened up the paper from Dallas. I'll never forget this. And I flipped over to what you and I used to call the classifieds. I don't know if even know if they still exist.
Yeah, does it still exist, right?
It's like the classifieds. And I started looking for intern architects, and Bruce, there were pages of them. There was a boom going on around the country at that time. And I circled in pen, intern architects, little experience needed. And I had some, I had done some internships while I was in school for some firms. And so I had a portfolio of work that I had, and I had 7 interviews. I got in my old 1975 Monte Carlo. I drove to Dallas. I probably had $40 in my pocket. Drove to Dallas, and I had all these interviews set up for one day, and I started just driving through town. I remember I had an old Mapsco. You remember those, the old Mapscos?
Exactly, the thick book.
I had an old Mapsco, and I was trying to figure out where I was going, and first place said, hey, no. The second place said no. I probably had on a 1970 vintage leisure suit too, because it probably was the only thing I owned at that time. Third place said no. I walked into the fourth place, Taylor Hewlett, and I went into the conference room, had my roll. I had my little weak resume with me. I sat down across the table for Ray Frazier. Ray Frazier was vice president of operations for Taylor Hewlett. At the time, the 4th largest architectural firm in the state of Texas. Their office was right on Beltline and the Tollway. The Tollway did not exist at that time. It was just, the access roads that had been built. He was the former professor of architecture at Texas Tech.
Oh, wow.
This guy was a stud. I learned more from Ray Frazier than all my years in school. Ray Frazier sat across from me, big burly guy. He unrolled my portfolio, my plans that I had worked on. And he said to me probably one of the greatest things that anyone's ever said to me regarding architecture. He looked over my stuff. He didn't say anything. He's just flipping pages. He's getting down. He's looking. He looks up and he said, this ain't half bad for an Oklahoma State kid. One of the greatest compliments I ever had, coming from a former professor of architecture at Texas Tech, and the firm was Texas Tech. I was a hired to kind of mix things up a little bit because most of the interns and architects were Tech boys. There's only 2 Oklahoma State kids in the whole mix. So they put me to work as an intern, and I was an intern architect, and I learned more than I ever could have learned. I thought I was going to be a gold watch architect, quite frankly. I fell in love with it. Most of the buildings on the North Dallas Tollway have my fingerprints on them. And it was an incredible time. And the architecture just went kaplunk. And I found myself needing to do something else. And so, I took what I knew. I only knew 2 things, architecture and theology, and applied them to something else and learned something else and did that and learned something else and did that and worked my way up and found myself, 10 years later, owning an architectural firm, being the, principal of an architectural firm, and then ultimately president of a business, and, just kind of navigated through all that. And then about 15, 16 years into my career, I was actually working for someone else, and life happened and I got fired. I'm like, the world has just come to an end.
It's over.
And it was like, I don't know what's going on. And didn't do anything wrong. It's just, we just didn't get along. And it's the first time in my life I never got along with anybody. And they were nice, and they said, hey, look, and I mean, they gave me a year severance, and we parted ways really great. And I'm sitting there going, this is what this feels like. This is weird. And I got a phone call. It's amazing how God's hand just kind of works, in life at times. We hear this all the time, door closed, door opens, things like that.
Right.
But it seems like everything that had been happening up to a certain point for a certain reason. And I got a phone call, and I went out and spent some time with some of the best consultants in the world regarding culture. And everything I had been working on, Bruce, if you had asked me to spell culture at that point, I couldn't have done it. Well, mostly because I can't spell, because I'm dyslexic. And I flew to Southern California, and I sat down and I said, well, this is how I look at life. And they said, that fits in really well with what we do. And I started a 12-year journey with one of the top cultural transformation firms on the planet. I'm a little biased because I spent so much time there, and had an opportunity to travel around the world. I mean, 44 countries, 3 million miles. I've had an opportunity to work with some of the greatest leaders on the planet. And, as an 18-year-old skinny kid from Oklahoma, if you had asked me my senior year where I saw myself in 20 years, let me tell you, it wouldn't have been anywhere close to that.
Yeah.
I've spoken to CEOs in Dubai and Bahrain and Cairo and, London and Berlin, all over the world. I never thought I was going to get out of Oklahoma. And it's amazing that as life goes, and to borrow a phrase from you, and we start to figure out where our lane is, we start to realize that everything that we're doing is putting a layer on top of who we are and how we are, and most importantly, why we are. And my purpose started just coming in. The aperture, when I was 18, the aperture was so wide, I couldn't see the whole picture because the aperture was so wide. And the more I started doing, the more I started, experiencing life, that aperture just got really tight, and come into focus. And I discovered my sweet spot, that, it really was about building people. And everything I had learned was about building people. And I developed relationships at a deep, deep level because I wanted to build people. I wanted to serve others. And one of those clients from 2008 was Brinker. And the economy crashed, and I was there to help and to serve. And we made some huge change. And when Doug Brooks, retired after 40 years, and they put Wyman Roberts in as CEO, Wyman took me to dinner one night and asked me if I'd consider being his chief people officer. And I'm like, I am not an HR guy. And he said, that's exactly why I want you. Because I saw life differently. I saw life, in a different way. And it's good sometimes, and other times, I have to make sure I surround myself. And over the years, it's been a lot of years now. And so, I have all of the HR things hanging on my wall, and, member of SHRM and, PHR. And I mean, heck, I even got a degree in HR, right? So I know all the things, but what got me here was a non-traditional path. I had to study how things were built, and then I had to study how people were built before I could ever get into the business of people, Not very many people know that story too, my friend. You have some way of pulling it out of me. I don't know what it is about you, but that's the complete unabridged version of how I got to where I am today. And so most of what I write about comes from a little bit of history, a little bit of life growing up. But I tell people this all the time. I typically write to remind myself of an important learning that I'm going through. And when I learn something, or when I'm experiencing something, I should say it that way. When I'm experiencing something and I don't want to forget it, I'm hardwired that if I don't write it down, I might forget it. And you call those mile markers. And I love that you created a journal that people can record these mile markers, because I think our life is filled with these mile markers. And for me, I write first and foremost as a reminder to myself as to what I've learned along the way, or what I've experienced along the way, so that I don't forget, or so when I do stumble, or when I do find myself in a hard spot, I can go back and read my own stuff. And so basically all I've done is just share my personal journal with you in a story that other people can relate to. And if other people benefit from it, then great.
Man, that is absolutely fantastic. I had Dustin Pascal on last week, and he called those small moments.
Yeah.
And just building on top of each other through his entire journey. I love that. I want to talk about your book, because you just now mentioned first of all, your first mentor was a youth pastor, and so we're talking about mentoring, and now you're talking about building people. And what I find fascinating about you and where you've taken your career as a leader in the HR space is that you've written books and you're writing story. And I was actually thinking, the very first book I read that you wrote was The Difference Maker, and it was about journaling. And well, I loved it because I love to journal. And then you write. You're writing this maker series, right? You're the king maker, the change maker, the news maker. And then all of a sudden this book comes out, and I'm holding it up for those who are listening, and it's called Saturday Morning Tea.
I know.
And I'm like, wait a minute. Wait
a minute.
There's no maker here.
Maker in that. I know it.
But it says, but this is what caught my attention, is the power of story to change everything. And so I would love to dive in a little bit about that. I just want to share a couple of things. One of the things is that Tony has a podcast called Breakfast with Sis. And I'm thinking, while I'm reading this, there's two characters in the book. It's Leah and the professor. And I'm thinking, is Leah Allie? Is the professor Tony? And I'm like, man, that is right on. But he has some helpful maxims to remember. And a couple of things I just want to share real quick. One of the things you talked about here is psychological safety. I don't think that is a real popular term, but I'm hearing it more and more and more. I thought that was interesting. And then the one thing that really grabbed my attention was never assume everyone knows what you know at the level you know. That was a very powerful moment. So could you just dive in? Tell me, first of all, why is this not a maker series? What was the thought behind that? And then number two, talk a little bit about just a couple of things in the book that people will enjoy.
So I have been getting requests and even pressure from publishers to write a traditional business book. And what I mean by traditional business book is, and don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking traditional business books. My wall is filled with them. But I've been getting a lot of pressure, not pressure, but, asked to write a traditional business book, 7 ways to do this, 3 things to do that, the 12 best things of this, or whatever the case may be, more along the more traditional business lines. And while I love those books, it hasn't been a style that's worked well for me. I tend to be a storyteller. So the Maker series is for the most part, the Difference Maker kind of sets off on its own. Then at the Kingmaker, I created a series of characters that went Kingmaker, Newsmaker, Changemaker, and that series of characters, regardless of what book you pick up, you can go anywhere into the series and start afresh and new, or you can read the whole thing all the way, and it kind of tells a big story. But I wanted to do something that just had 2 characters and a simple plot line, because all my other books have multiple plot lines. There's a lot of things going on, and they teach leadership lessons as you kind of go through. But Bruce, if you've read them, they're more subtle leadership lessons that you learn just by experiencing the characters. I wanted something that was not a traditional 12 ways to do something this way, tick, tick, tick. But I wanted something that was a little more overt, and also wanted something that you can get in and out of super quick. Now, traditional Maker Series book, I try to keep it between 50 and 60,000 words so you can get in and out of it, depending on how fast you read, 3 to 4 hours. I wanted something that somebody could get in and out of in an hour and a half, maybe a couple hours, enjoy it and go back to it, and then have learning lessons. And so I actually changed the format of this. And I went back and forth. The working title changed 8 times probably. But it is loosely based off of this amazing relationship I've had with my daughter for going on 16, 17 years now, that we've had a standing morning Saturday breakfast since she was 13 years old. And, I've told this story a million times, but, when she was 13, hormones were going this way, moms were going this way. And I ended up taking her to breakfast just to get her out of the house. And, we didn't say anything at breakfast. We just went down the street to the first place we came to, which was a Chick-fil-A in our hometown of Flower Mound at that time. And we sat there in silence, and she ate her chicken minis. I had my biscuit, and we drank sweet tea, and we didn't say anything. And driving home, just kind of being a smart aleck, I popped off and said, well, that was fun. She didn't say anything. And I said, well, you want to do it again next week? And, she just quietly said, sure. And, 13, 14 years later, she's 29. She just turned 29. And we still get together every Saturday morning, and we just talk about life. We just talk about what it means to grow up. And it was getting through high school, it was getting through college, and then it was trying to find a job, and then it was starting our own business, and then it's working with people, and it's just life. And selfishly, 3 years ago, I wanted to start recording or preserving these conversations. And so selfishly, I told her, I said, hey, let's start a podcast. And I was secretly wanting to do it just so I would have a record, a kind of a digital diary that when I'm gone, she would always have that, right? Well, my daughter, if you know my daughter, she's like famous. And we had no idea that when we launched Breakfast with Sis, that it would actually kind of go viral. And so, we have people listening to it in 26, 27 countries around the world. And they come for her, they stay for me, is what she says. And so when I sit down and I wanted to write a book about stories, that format of, a first-time manager, first-time leader, Leah, was struggling, and she comes across this professor. Now, look, not that I consider myself a professor or anything along that line. I just needed a character that she would listen to. And so we wrote this story, and it really is a very simple guide to culture. And, culture is made up of people, and it's made up of the way people think, feel, and act. And believe it or not, how we think and feel comes from the stories that we hear. And so we talk, I talk in the book about the 3 stories that we're constantly telling every single day, and the 3 stories that we're receiving every single day when we show up, speak up, and sync up. And when those stories don't align, you have a cultural challenge at your feet. And most people try to muscle their way through culture change, and it's really not that hard, but we make it hard. Now, just because it's simple doesn't always make it easy either, right? Because, my doctor recently told me that I needed to shed a few pounds, and he said it's really simple, eat right and exercise. But you and I both know that that's not always easy. So it's a blueprint of sorts to help navigate change. And when you talk about psychological safety, that's a term that was coined before Dr. Edmondson, but Dr. Amy Edmondson actually kind of brought it to life in its grandest. And the simple definition is my ability to speak up without the fear of being blown up amongst my peers, right? And it's that safety I feel that I can share what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling without the fear of any kind of repercussion coming back. I think it's a pretty important term right now, actually. So we talk a lot about that. We talk about, when you don't get results, what are the culprits that hold you back? And, that's in the book. And there's lessons at the end. It's written in, I think, a fairly easy way to understand, what are the key takeaways. She's keeping a journal. I'm a big journal guy too. If I turn my camera just a little bit here to my left, you would see probably 15 working journals. Yours among them.
Yeah,
that are in the works right now, and I've got a journal for just about everything. So it's a story about stories. That's what it is, and it's super quick. I don't know how long it took you to read it, but it's a pretty quick read.
Well, one thing that we were talking before we started recording, and this really puts it in essence: a timeless message at the right time. That's what it is, and I want to encourage everybody to go out and pick up a copy of this. I'll put it in the show notes. But at the end of the one of the chapters, it says a helpful maxim to remember. So you have these maxims, which I love it because you put it in simple. I'm a simple guy. I need simple. But it says we live our story every day in what we do, say, and repeat, personally and professionally. Isn't that the truth?
So true. So true. You know what's really cool? That if we don't get that story completely 100% right, which we all skin our knees. I don't know about you, but I got plenty of skin knees and I got a lot of scar tissue.
I'm still bleeding.
Here's what's really cool about life. When we don't get that story completely 100% right, every day we get an opportunity to start our day, turn to a clean page, and start writing a new story. And I think that's what's really, really cool. A lot of people get down. A lot of people get discouraged that their story is already pre-written. I want people to have courage and be encouraged that they can write a new story. I think too many people get caught up believing that their story's pre-written. I don't want anybody to have that kind of burden. We all have an opportunity to write a new story each and every day. And so the question that we need to ask ourselves is, what is the story we want to write today?
I love that. It's great encouragement. Again, I'm holding up the book. It's Saturday Morning Tea by Tony Bridwell. Definitely need to check this book out. And I've read it a couple of times now. And every time I read it, it also creates like that time of reflection. Like, okay, let me think about this compared to, am I really living the story that I want to live, or do I want to change? My book, Find Your Lane, is really about finding the way that works for you, right? But just now, whenever you mention that we have a chance to write a new story each day, that's the same thing with Find Your Lane. Every day you're trying to find your lane and navigate, and it's to whatever that purpose is you have. I love your story because when I think about Tony Bridwell, I think about a missionary in the workplace. He's on a mission to encourage and equip people in the workplace. And that's my story. That's what I want to tell. And that's why I wanted to have Life in Leadership Lane. I want to talk to leaders making a difference. And I want people that are listening to take one thing to help them get better, to equip them to get better. And so I appreciate you sharing this. You have shared so much today. I love this. I know that you talked about meeting with your daughter for breakfast. So Breakfast with Sis is a podcast that people want to tune into. I want to dive into real quick. I want to dive into leadership practice. So leadership every day. You talked about, building people and teams. But what about Tony, building Tony? Can you share what's one thing? I know you talked a little bit about journaling and reading. What's one or two things that you have in your daily practice every day that helps you stay on track?
That's a great question. And it's probably one that we get asked the most on our podcast and when I write and when I get questions, Bruce. And look, for me, it starts with where I spend my early morning moments before I start my day. For me, it's important that what I put in at the very beginning has a big impact on my day. So starting my day right. And so I spend time studying and reading and journaling. But really, if you've listened to our podcast, if you've read anything that I've written, it's really about that board of directors, right? It's about having that personal board that surrounds you, that I'm able to check in with, that I'm able to draw energy from. And I think from a daily routine, it's about spending time being quiet, taking care of yourself. What goes in comes out, right? So taking care of yourself, but then surrounding yourself with, we call it a personal board of directors, at least 3 people in your life, somebody who's ahead of you, somebody who's in the same season, and somebody that you're bringing along. And I think that right there is probably one of the best pieces of counsel that I could give somebody as you kind of navigate, right? Because we all need those people. I talk about this frequently. When I wrote The Kingmaker, I studied a lot of kings. I spent a lot of time digging into the life of many kings, and you and I know it as the book of Ecclesiastes, but it's actually a personal journal of a very famous historic king, King Solomon, that lived well over 3,000 years ago. And it's rare that you get to read into the personal journal of someone who ruled much of the land at that point in time. And it's interesting, he wrote something in his own personal journal that's really stuck with me when I read it. It's a pretty famous proverb that says 2 are better than 1 because there's a good return for that investment. Should one fall, the other is there to pick them up. But pity the person who falls and has no one there to pick them up. And it's been very eye-opening as I go through life and I look back and I check those mile markers and I find out that I struggled the most when I didn't have somebody to pick me up, when I didn't surround myself with those individuals that would be there when I skinned my knee, which, by the way, we all skin our knees. I stand at the front of that line. But surrounding ourselves with people that bring us courage, right? Put courage into us, encourage us, but yet be willing to hold us to a level of accountability that says that they believe in us and that they trust in us. And they're willing to pick us up when we fall and put us back on path. You know, when your young grandson started walking, and he dropped down and bounced his very first time, as a grandparent, you know, you'd scoop him up, stand him up and say, do it again. Yeah. And do it again was not fall. Yeah. Do it again was take another step. Go, let's go. I'm scooping you up. I'm showing you it's okay. Do it again. But at some point in time in life, Bruce, we stop as grown-ups, we stop focusing on the steps, and unfortunately we spend way too much time focusing on the fall. And in reality, we need to surround ourselves with people that's willing to scoop us up and say, do it again. And what they mean is take another step. And when we stop focusing so much on the fall and we start focusing more on the steps, we'll actually start moving a little bit more than we are today.
Man, I absolutely, oh man, I love that. That's fantastic. That is fantastic. I tell you, I could, honestly, Tony, I could go all day talking to you. We're down to our last couple of minutes, a time I like to call it's time to accelerate. And I wanted to really just focus on this one question. And I was actually thinking about this. Dear Younger Me is a song I absolutely enjoyed by Mercy Me. And it makes me think about if 10 years older Tony were to walk to your doorstep today, what is he telling Tony today?
This is a very timely question. Every year around my birthday, I write a blog post that is a open letter to the younger me. So you go back and look at my blogs, you will find an open letter to the younger me for years and years and years. And so this is my vacation week, so I'm actually on summer break this week. And so I have been crafting out that very letter, Bruce, right now. And the title of it this year was Another Trip Around the Sun, an open letter to the younger me. And so what would I tell the younger me? But in your case, what would, if they came back and told me now? And so I've been crafting that together currently as we talk. And there's typically three things that I like to pull out of every year, every trip around the sun. What are the three takeaways from this last trip around the sun? And for me, they've been formulating into a couple of categories. The first one is a reminder that we're all at a different place in this journey we call life. And what that means is you can't expect that everybody knows what you know at the level that you know. It was one of the very first quotes you read out of the book. And we put a lot of pressure on people, myself included, that we have an expectation that they are thinking exactly the same way I'm thinking, because I'm thinking that way, everybody else should be thinking that way. But yet I don't know their journey. I don't know what's brought them to this point in their life. And expectations in families, expectations in marriages, when they're not established really, really well, they cause problems. And I think one of my learnings has been that extending a little extra grace in not just knowing, but understanding. And that comes to the second point. The second point is frequently it is easy to confuse knowing with understanding. When you go through psychological IO, and it's the study of culture, basically. They talk about KSAs, right? KSAs are knowledge, skills, and abilities, and they typically rate people and organizations on KSAs. I think there's a letter missing. I think it's U, and U is for understanding, because I can have knowledge, I can have skills, and I can have ability, but if I don't understand often the why, I'm lacking. And there is a difference between knowing and understanding. I think this last trip around the sun for me has really brought home the need for more understanding to go along with our knowledge, because we talk about knowledge frequently. Having the knowledge, it's not enough. It's about understanding. That's the second thing. And the third thing is, in order to really impact change, you have to change the story. And what I've been watching is that certain stories, and I wrote about this recently on LinkedIn, certain stories are more sticky. Stories of fear can move people. However, the stickiness wears off when the adrenaline wears off. And then I have to muscle, or I have to keep fear going to keep you moving. Stories of hope, though, are self-sustaining. Because when I have hope, when I know that there's something out there, not a wish, but an assurance, I will self-motivate myself to move that way. And so what I've learned is that this last trip around the sun has really taught me that when I use fear, and there's a lot of different types of fear, Bruce. I mean, there is fear that I can emotionally blackmail somebody, right? Do this or else. We hear this in business a lot. Do this or else. And that emotional blackmail, while it will cause somebody to move, what I've learned is that it will also build resentment behind the scenes. And that silent resentment festers. And what happens is we confuse movement through fear as progress. In reality, all we're doing is we're just lighting this slow simmer of resentment in the background. And then at some point, when the adrenaline wears off, that resentment starts to grow. And it's been very eye-opening for me personally that I have to put myself in check and say, am I moving people? Am I telling stories that are stories of fear, or am I telling stories that are stories of hope? Because fear will build a silent resentment that will come out in the future. And I think that for me, those have been the three big things, the three big learnings of my last trip around. Probably come out on a blog post sometime this week. That's pretty heavy. I'm sorry.
Perfect timing. I love it. It reminds me of what Carson says on Downton Abbey. We must always travel in hope.
Love that.
It's Saturday morning tea. It's Tony Bridwell, the power of story to change everything. Today has been such an honor. Tony, I appreciate you. I appreciate our friendship and just being on the show. Tell me, if someone wanted to follow your blog, follow you, connect with you, how would they do that?
A lot of different ways to do that. Obviously LinkedIn. You can see most everything on LinkedIn. My website, tonybridwell.com, has a ton of that on it also. I haven't been doing much social media of late, but I am on social media. I mean, Breakfast with Sis, we are on hiatus until July the 18th, 2020, summer break, because I'm on summer break this week, and so is Allie. But there's a lot of different ways. LinkedIn is a great place to go. TonyBridwell.com is a great place to go. And of course, you can find all the books on Amazon, along with the rest of the world, quite frankly.
Well, I appreciate you, my friend. Timeless message at the right time. This was the right time. I appreciate your time and wish you all the best, my friend.
I appreciate you.